industry structure and capital are only part of the story. Behind all of this is the science itself, how we understand the brain, how we design therapies, and how we translate research into real clinical impact. Then thanks for having us.
Hey, Elaine, good to be here.
So let's just start by talking about something familiar. Mental health is increasingly being described as a global crisis, but why? Why are those issues such a crisis across the globe?
Yeah, I think, these are really unprecedented times. If you think about it, where we as humans are pretty much available all day, every day of the week, every day of the year, in terms of having our phones, our computers, our smartwatches. It's a lot of pressure. Our brains are bombarded with so much stimuli that they really haven't had time to adapt to. And we found this out during the pandemic, unfortunately. The pandemic for neuroscientists was like a big petri dish for a few years. And what I mean by that is we saw what happened when people were isolated, so social isolation, and when also they were not in control of what was going on around them, and there was a lot of uncertainty. Those things were sort of the perfect storm for an incredible amount of stress and mental health issues, particularly depression and anxiety. In fact, the rate of depression in this country went up 25% during and after the pandemic. And we think that that is because of, as I mentioned, so many aspects of our life changed quickly. Our brain didn't have time to adapt to them. So not only are we fighting the technology in society today and our brain's inability to deal with all of that stress, but then coming out of a pandemic where you throw a whole bunch of uncertainty into there and it's threatening, and basically our brain operates in threat mode. And that's what we think is contributing globally to this epidemic of mental health issues.
But when we talk about it as a crisis, what often surprises people is how under-resourced this space still is. Why do you think there is such a gap in funding for mental health compared to other major conditions like cancer, diabetes, or heart disease?
Yeah, it's sobering when you look at the statistics globally. Mental health, and in the US, this is the case as well. We spend only about 2% of our total health budgets on mental health. Even though depression is right up there, in fact, a little higher than back pain for total disability money. In other words, the amount of disability days lost, things like that for depression is even higher than back pain. It's number one in this country now. Yet we only spend about 2% of our budget on this. And one of the reasons we think that is that there's a stigma attached to mental health. All right, when we talk about mental health, we don't really talk about it as a medical condition or in terms of biology, right? And part of that is because you can't see it. Think of all the specialties, the doctors, the medical specialties that exist. If I am a radiologist, I can see a tumor growing on your lung. If I'm a cardiologist, I can measure that your heart is an AFib. If I'm a cancer specialist, I can see the cancer growing in your blood. You can visualize all this. In mental health, it's really the only specialty where you're treating a patient based on something you cannot see. All right. And so it really becomes difficult then to convince organizations and groups and even companies to invest in mental health because it's so abstract. And until we get to that point where we truly see it for what it is, for biology, for a medical condition, it's probably going to stay that way. And also the stigma that's attached to it.
Yes, and the way that you diagnose mental health issues are really like if someone's having a mental health issue, you cannot like say it directly, oh, you have that issue. It's by various different testing or everything, the ultimate goal is just to say, okay, we probably diagnose you have some kind of mental health issue. And that funding gap that you mentioned just now often shows up in innovation. So why has there been relatively little innovation in new mental health drugs, particularly for depression?
Oh yeah, it's and again, because of this low funding, this funding gap, it really from a business perspective doesn't incentivize a lot of companies to go after drugs for mental health. And it goes back to what you just mentioned. When you're looking to do research in mental health, particularly depression, anxiety, things like that, how you measure if your drug works is very subjective. The endpoints in a clinical trial, let's say for depression, it's not a blood marker, it's not imaging. It is a psychiatrist interviewing the patient and giving their opinion of how depressed this patient is. Okay, so it's very subjective. And, it's I can have 3 psychiatrists interviewing the same patient, and they can have slightly different ideas of how severely depressed this patient is. So it becomes difficult. We do have standardized interviews, but you can only do so much when at the end of the day, it's someone's opinion, right? And so based on that, if you're a drug company doing drug development, depression, for example, has the lowest probability of success for getting approved. When you look through the entire process of getting a drug from the bench to approval, it's somewhere around 1 to 2% of drugs will make it. With that low probability of success, a lot of companies have said, we're not even in this game. It's too risky for us. In addition to that, because of the nature of the human brain and our perception of our world, right? Placebo response is a big issue with doing clinical trials in depression and other mental health disorders. I can give someone who is depressed a sugar pill, right? And I can make them believe that it's a real drug. They will have a 40% improvement in their depression.
Oh.
Okay, it's amazing the power of expectation of our brain. So again, if you're doing a clinical study and you want to show that your drug really works, placebo already does 40%. You have to do a lot better than that. So the bar is set high. And there have been a lot of failures in the past in mental health drugs. So a lot of companies have just said, we're out of it. We're not even going to be in this area anymore.
And beyond drug development, there's also the broader question of how modern life is shaping our mental health. So from a neuroscientist perspective, what are your thoughts on how today's fast-paced, high-stress society is affecting our brains?
Yeah, this is where our epidemic comes into play. If you think about our brains, we as humans, our brains have evolved for 1 million years, right? And for the vast majority of that time in evolution, we lived in a society where survival wasn't guaranteed every day. This idea of society today where I can go online and order food and have it delivered to me, right? I have a shelter over my head, a house, a car. That did not exist for the vast existence of humankind, right? Those 1 million years. Think about the way society was, let's say, even a couple thousand years ago. We didn't have all of this. We hunted for our food. We fought for it. We had neighboring tribes that we were constantly at battle with. Nothing was guaranteed. So the bottom line is, what we say in the field is that our brain has not evolved to match societal evolution. And because of that, we still have this old brain that wants to react to threat, to stress in a very physical way. So whereas our brain has been wired so that if you hear something in the bushes at night and you can't see it, alarms go off. You're afraid. Your sympathetic system kicks in. So it's fight or flight, right? Yeah. These days, our stress is more internally generated. So I have a lot of meetings today. My 401k may not be doing well. Is my kid going to get into a good college? These aren't those stressors from thousands of years ago, but our body still reacts the same. So what we think a big part of all this is in our fast-paced society is that this stress is internally generated stress, and it's creating this external stress response. Our brain doesn't know how to differentiate those emails versus a saber-toothed tiger, right? It's still that old brain. And that's, bottom line is we're not able to manage that. It hasn't evolved as fast as society has.
And if stress is such a constant factor in modern life, the natural follow-up is how we can manage it. What does the scientific evidence tell us about how to mitigate or manage the effect of stress on the brain?
Yeah, that's a big field of study right now,
Mhm.
obviously. And what we're finding, it's a little bit scary that chronic stress over a long period of time, can lead to physical changes in your brain. Changes in your brain so that it makes it hard for you to use the uniquely human part of your brain. And what I mean by that is we as humans have a very unique part of our brain that allows us to do things like empathize with other people, take someone else's perspective. Let's say someone has a different viewpoint than you. You can put your viewpoint aside and maybe try to understand where they're coming from. These are things that we, as unique to humans, right, that we can do. We can manage our emotions. We can manage our needs. When you are under stress, that part of your brain sort of goes offline. So now you're more reactive. You're less able to manage your emotions. You're more like an animal in that if you're hungry, you're going to find food. If you have a gut instinct that you don't like something, you may fight or lash out. So what we're finding is that to manage this stress, there are some ways to work with our brain instead of against it. Our brain has a lot of ways, a lot of mechanisms to deal with stress and what stress does to it. But we have to optimize the situation. So there's some research that's out there. It's called the Blue Zone studies. And this is research looking at areas across the globe where people live long lives, but they live them healthy. They're 100 years old and they're walking around, gardening. They're not in a wheelchair. And what we're finding for these Blue Zone studies is very interesting. These sort of practical ways to keep your brain resilient and healthy. A few of them have to do with simple things that you've probably heard a lot. Plant-based diet is a big one. Okay, not eating a lot of meat, intermittent fasting. These are things that we found out. Yes, they're good for your health, but they directly affect your brain and your brain's ability to deal with stress. All right, so those are some of the things that we found that are very powerful to be able to do that.
So looking beyond lifestyles and stress management, there's also a great deal of work happening in clinical innovation. What's on the horizon in terms of novel therapies that could meaningfully address this mental health crisis?
Yes, so we've had the same drugs on the market for many decades now. And finally, I think we're getting to a point with technology that we're advancing. So to be able to attack mental health from a different perspective. One of the big ones are psychedelic medicines. They've been around for a long time, and we're starting to find psilocybin, so mushrooms, LSD, drugs like that have a particular use in the mental health space. And we're starting to see the mechanism behind it and how it can help for severe cases of mental health, depression, PTSD. We're also moving in the field to drugs that aren't systemic. Okay, so usually you take a drug, it goes into your bloodstream, and it hits a whole bunch of different parts of your body and brain. We're moving away from that to drugs that don't enter your bloodstream, so you don't have all these side effects. Neurotoxins are ones that are being explored for mental health as well. You've probably heard of Botox. It's being looked at, these different types of toxins on how they can help with mental health, particularly depression. We're also looking at medicine that focuses on the patient now, not just a one size fits all. How can we figure out, based on your, let's say, brainwaves, what therapies would work best for you? So we're looking at that to be able to get to what we call patient-centric medicine, that's specific for you as an individual, because in mental health, there's a lot of variability, and what works for one person may not work for another.
And to bring this conversation back to something practical for our listeners, what's one thing that people can do, maybe starting today, right after watching our videos, to help keep their brain strong and resilient?
Yeah. So this is a big field of study now, brain resilience. Okay. And with good reason, because we're going to encounter stress, and it's not practical to say, well, I'm going to avoid all stress in my life. It's build up the areas of your brain that can deal with it naturally. All right. Because what we're finding is chronic stress causes inflammation. And we're starting to see things like dementia, Parkinson's, cancer, all these things can be a factor of the stress you encounter. So one practical thing that we talk about that's really solidly studied is by building up these brain areas with, I mentioned that plant-based diet, which is a good one, mindfulness training and meditation. There's a lot of evidence around the ability to just take a step back, slow your brain down just for a few minutes, shut it off, and let it, almost like a computer, reboot, clean itself out. Mindfulness training, if you're familiar with that, and there's a lot of apps on how to do mindfulness training, has been shown to decrease the bad things that stress does to the brain. So people who regularly practice mindfulness training, we see them less susceptible to burnout, better able to manage stress. So that's one place I would start. That's somewhat simple to do and implement. There's a lot of apps out there where you can get started right away.
Yeah, that's like practicing and training your brain as a stronger CPU as like in the
Exactly.
computer.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Thank you so much, Dan. It was a very great conversation. From industry strategy to brain science, it's clear that meaningful progress in mental health will require alignment across all levels. Thank you so much again for sharing your insights with us today. And thank you to everyone for tuning in to Beryl Leads.